Starting to circle again, going live. Oh, it says now you're live. Okay, it's on. Yes, 3 people on, so that's a good sign, I guess, that other people can watch it. Nathan Reeves, yeah, he's selling. You got it? Okay, well, good. We only have about a minute, so anyway, I'll turn my phone off. But if something happens, just give me a text. All right, thanks, Nathan. Good to have help. Oh, it's 7 o'clock. Okay, so it's about time to start. And we have 5 people on. Okay, that's good. You ready to start? Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming to our little Bible study. Looks like we've got 5 people listening, and we may probably get up and much higher than that as time goes on. So tonight we're going to continue in our study we started last week about the kings of Israel. But tonight we're going to look at King Saul and his life, not just to do a get the facts speech about his life, but to actually look at some of his personality and the personal challenges he faced and lessons we can learn from how he either did it right or did it wrong. So if you bow your heads, we'll ask a blessing. Right again? Okay. Our eternal great God, we thank you very much now for this evening. We thank you for your word and the richness of it and all we can learn, how it can guide our lives. So we thank you now for this chance to get together here on this with this technology that has been made available. And we just ask you to bless that and certainly to take care of us and help us this evening. In Jesus Christ's name, amen. I'm going to begin tonight by reading first from a book. This book is called All the Kings and Queens of the Bible. It's one of those books that's been around in a series by a man named Lockyer, been around for many years. It takes a kind of a simple approach to most subjects. So I think it's easier than to read something like this as kind of a beginning. As we look through the life of King Saul, his personality and his challenges, his mistakes, his vulnerabilities, his envy, his desire to be a great king that, of course, he failed in because of his own weaknesses. But first, I want to read some of the observations here out of this book. The history of Saul exhibits the tragedy of a soul, a great and gifted soul, for he was a brave and accomplished monarch and was noble in many ways, yet a soul disturbed by evil spirits who died a despairing suicide in a lost battle. Amongst all the noble creations of Greek poetry, there's no single figure more vividly portrayed than that of Saul as he comes before us in the inspired records of Israel. Saul, the son of Kish, represented the insignificant tribe of Benjamin, as did his namesake in the New Testament. Thus, Saul is the most distinguished name in the genealogies of the tribe of Benjamin. Remember that Saul, who became the Apostle Paul, was also a Benjaminite. And so he had a kind of a similarity here with this previous King Saul. The Old Testament Saul became a king after man's heart, as David became king after God's heart. His history is typical of the sin and rejection of the Jews and of God raising up sons unto Abraham from among the Gentiles. The promise and disaster of Saul's reign reminds us of Macbeth in Shakespeare's profound tragedy. And like Macbeth, Saul's career opened with a splendid victory, and like him, falls under terrible influences, and like him, progresses through jealous fears, despair, and murder. And so maybe some of Shakespeare's writings were based on some of the Bible stories here, apparently. The beginning of Saul's reign was auspicious enough. The afflicted Israelites were not content to have God as their king and Samuel as their prophet judge. They wished to be ruled by a visible sovereign as surrounding heathen nations were. And by using Samuel's evil sons as an excuse, demanded that Samuel should provide them with a king. The prophet, discerning the sin behind the people's request, rebuked them, but God overruled their sin and permitted the establishment of the monarchy. Saul, because of his commanding personality, appealed to the carnal Israelites and was given to them by God in his anger. So his physical form, his height, and apparently his demeanor were something that people would admire, and they would want to follow him into battle. But the people were going to learn by experience the difference between a physical king and God as our king. Saul's benefiting qualifications for kingship are impressive. He had remained true to God, or had he remained true to God, he would have carried a niche for himself in the royal gallery as a mighty king. He was tall and the kind of man people would turn around and look to with admiration. He was modest to begin with, chapter 10. He knew how to keep a secret until it was time to speak. He did not deem his kinship inconsistent with common work. He was a brave leader, except on one memorable occasion in chapter 17. His exploits secured for him a deep place in the hearts of his people when they confirmed him into the kingdom in chapter 9, verse 21. He possessed the great quality of patriotism, had a zeal for his people, although it was not always zeal surrounding his knowledge. He fought hard for the nation, and in spite of long wars, he left the kingdom consolidated. In his early days, Saul exhibited clemency to political opponents like Julius Caesar. He refused to be severe because of God's goodness. He was blessed in Jonathan with a gallant son who tried to keep him from persecuting David. Father and son were lovely and pleasant in their lives, and in death they were not divided. 2 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 23. He received the Holy Spirit on 2 occasions. God endowed or anointed Saul, not in favor, but in the sense of acquiescence of Psalm 106 and verse 15. He was given another heart, the only man of the Old Testament of whom it is said God gave him another heart. That's chapter 10 and verse 9. He had to be followed as a king. From his coronation onwards, he had to be treated as the Lord's anointed. In the people's acceptance of Saul as king, there arose the strain embodied in the anthem, God Save the King. We've all heard that song sung a number of times. He had the advice and prayers of Samuel and the offices of the high priest of the ark and the inspiring psalms of Israel's psalmist. So all those things are mentioned in connection with Saul. In spite of all the gifts and encouragements showered upon him, he failed in a state of probation. Difficulties bring out a man's true character and reveal where trust should be placed. He had self-pride, he had self-will, he had self-aid. He rejected following God at the end of his life and wanted to seek counsel from a demon or familiar spirit. How tragic was the end of Saul. His presence and the influence of Saul were withdrawn. God's presence was, the Spirit's anointing was removed. He became the victim of mental disturbances. And of course, we all know some of the history of some of that, which we'll look at this evening. Another commentary here I have says, like everyone else, Saul had his virtues and his failings. His chief weakness seems to have been want of decision of character. He was easily swayed by events and by people. He obviously wanted people to like him and approve of him. He says that several times. The praises of David in chapter 18, verse 7, set his fire of jealousy on fire. His persecution of David was largely partly due to the instigation of mischievous courtiers, in other words, Saul's advisors, but also then they played upon Saul's weaknesses. We'll look at some of these. I don't need to read all of that. His virtues, Saul possessed many high qualities. His respect of the office was only equaled by the coolness with which he accepted it. The first call to action he responded with promptly when needed to lead an army in chapter 11. His timely aid excited the last gratitude of citizens of Jabesh Gilead. Saul was openly disowned by Samuel and openly disowned by God, rejected by God, and yet he still served over 30 years after that and did the very best that he could, even though he was chasing David and trying to do some things that obviously were not correct. Now, let's begin by looking at a verse we looked at last week. I want to go to 1 Samuel chapter 15, and we want to start in verse 26. This is the final rejection of Saul by God as given to him by Samuel. Samuel said to Saul, I will not return with you, For you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. So Saul rejecting what God said to do, and of course this was the case about Agag. God said through Samuel that Saul was now being rejected as being king over Israel. Samuel turned to go away, but he laid on upon the skirt of his mantle, and it tore. And Samuel said to him, the Lord has rent the kingdom of Israel from you this day, and has given it to a neighbor of yours that is better than you. Now, the next thing is Saul is told by Samuel, don't try to change this because it is a final decision. He says, also, the strength of Israel will not lie nor repent, for he is not a man that he should repent. In other words, Samuel sort of knew Saul would try to do all he could to change the decision, but Samuel was saying, no, God says it is final. So we have some of that in the rest of this chapter where Saul tries to worship God and get sort of back into his place. But we're going to need to look at a number of things here. But first, what I'm going to look at is down in chapter 16, verse 13. Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brethren. Now we're breaking into the account of David being anointed with oil by Samuel at the home of his father and his other brothers. And he's going to be, he's anointed here as king while he's still a very young man. He's probably 17. That's the best guess. He did not become the king of Israel until age 30. So it would have been 13 years of basically running from King Saul and kind of trying to save himself while he was also leading a small army. But he had 13 years on the run, 13 years of testing here for King David before he became king. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brethren, and the Spirit of the Lord came to David from that day forward. So Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. Now, sometimes we stop there, but verse 14 is also important. It says, but the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul. So when the Spirit of God came to David and sat upon him as one anointed to be king, the Spirit of the Lord left Saul at the same time. So you almost get the impression that only one person can have this anointed Spirit of God to be king over Israel at any one time. Certainly that kind of looks like what it is. So the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, but an evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. So God allows demons to do certain things. They like to trouble people. They like to cause issues. They like to pester. They like to threaten. They like to mess up all sorts of things. But in most cases, they are restrained and they're not allowed to. In this case, though, God then allowed this evil spirit to torment Saul, perhaps trying to get him to see himself or change or something. But at any rate, we have this account here where the Spirit of God left Saul, and it did come then to one who would be king later, King David. Now let's go over to chapter 17. We touched on some of these things last week. Chapter 17, of course, is the account of David killing Goliath. And this is apparently where Saul was introduced to David, where they first became in contact and got to know each other, so to speak. And David came in and said that he would volunteer to go fight the Philistine named Goliath. And we've all heard the story many times. And of course, Saul offered to let him use his armor and sword, and it was too big. It was too heavy. David said he simply couldn't do that. So he took his staff in his hand and 5 stones. Apparently, he was very good with a sling and took those out with him. Now, David was able to kill Goliath, as you know that. God helped him. And of course, he brought the head of Goliath back with him as a trophy and to show the people of Israel that the champion of the enemy was dead. So in chapter 18, verse 1, it came to pass with an end of speaking unto Saul that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. So when the battle was over and David had the head of this Philistine named Goliath, and basically brought it back to the king to show him that the enemy was dead, then Jonathan and David became friends. So Jonathan, the crown prince, the oldest son of King Saul, and then David became very good friends. And verse 2 says, Saul took him that day. And I wish we knew more about this. Did Jonathan request it, or did King Saul simply say, this young man is obviously, God is with him, or he's a very good warrior, he's good with a sling, whatever it is. Saul took him that day and would let him go no more to the home of his father's house. It's one of the warnings that Samuel had told the people of Israel: a king will take your sons, and you will no longer have those sons. He will take them and make them in his army or in his service. So let's drop down now to verse 6. This is the first time, and in fact, we're going to spend some time. I think we have time tonight to look at the 21 times that Saul tried to kill David. Unless you go through them, it's hard to believe there were 21 times recorded for us. And this probably isn't all of them, but certainly it is quite a large number. So chapter 18 and verse 6, it came to pass as they came, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, that the women came out of the cities of Israel. This is traditional. The women would celebrate and sing because God had given a great victory to Israel. Started back when they came out of Egypt with Miriam. The women came out of the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tabrets and with joy and with instruments of music. The women answered one another as they played. So they played kind of a chant. One side would say, la-ti-da-ti-da. The other side would say la-ti-da-ti-da. And they had this thing going back and forth as they asked questions and answered them while they were singing. And one side said, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. Now, this is where we begin to see into the inner character and the flaws of Saul. That Saul became very jealous because somebody else, David, got accolades and more approbation than him. So if I were a psychologist, I would say that Saul probably had kind of an inferiority complex. Maybe one reason why he hid in the baggage when they were going to make him king. But he there then was very, very jealous. Verse 8, Saul was very wroth, and the saying displeased him. And he said, they have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed but thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom? So David was David didn't say much, but Saul was very, very upset. Now there's a little summary here I want to read to you in this Dake's commentary about the effects, the tenfold effects of this event where Saul was jealous because David had more praise by the women. Number one, he was very wroth or very angry. Says the saying. Number two, the saying displeased him. Number three, he said, they give David more glory than they give me. So, but he was upset by it. Number four, he eyed David from that day on. Number five, an evil spirit of jealousy and insanity came upon him to prophesy. In other words, to say things that were basically inspired by this spirit. Number seven, Saul cast a javelin at David to kill him while he was under this influence of the demon. He was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, and he departed out of his own life. So that's in verse 12. He was jealous because he could see that God was with David and God was no longer with him. That may have been the real core of what this jealousy was all about. So Israel and Judah loved David with increasing love. So Saul deceitfully planned on taking David's life using the Philistines. Now let's go back to chapter 18. We'll look at incident 1 and incident 2 when David was, his life was attempted to be killed by King Saul. I might mention that Rod and Gloria are here tonight, and Stella Helterbrand is here, and my wife, so we have a little bit of a crowd. So, verse 9. Verse 9. So Saul eyed David from that day forward, and it came to pass on the morrow that the evil spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied in the midst of the house. So he said sayings that were basically the demons prophesying, or the demons perhaps causing him to be angry and say things, prophesying or saying things of a supernatural nature, I guess you might say, inspired by this demonic spirit. So as at the other times, there was a javelin in Saul's hand, and Saul cast the javelin, for he said, I will smite David even to the wall with it. Now, notice the next sentence. David avoided out of his presence twice. Did you ever catch that before? So he tried this spear thing apparently twice. He threw the spear at him, and David was able to escape it twice. So this is time 1 and time 2 of David's life being threatened, or Saul trying to take it. So Saul was afraid of David, and because the Lord was with him, and the spirit then was departed, or David was departed from Saul. Now, this next verse is interesting too. It says, therefore Saul removed him from him and made him as captain over 1,000, and he went out and came in before the people. So the army of Israel was somewhere around 80 to 100,000. We don't know the exact number, but those numbers are kind of in the ballpark. He had been, after the slaying of Goliath, the head general of all, let's just use the figure, 80,000 soldiers. So now Saul demotes David down to a captain of 1,000 instead of the captain of 80,000, and head over all the captains of 1,000. So he's gone through a serious demotion here. He went from, lieutenant general down to major, so to speak. And he also was removed out of the palace. So instead of staying in the palace with Saul and Jonathan and the family like he had been, he is now removed out of the palace. He's demoted. Now the question is, did David throw a tantrum? Did he throw a fit? Did he get angry? Did he get jealous? Let's read. Verse 14, David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. Now, many people have experienced something like David, where they've been demoted, where they've had they've lost a business, or something has happened to them, when they've just frankly been treated in their eyes unfairly. And it's happened to most of us, believe me. The challenge isn't that it happens. The challenge is, how do we react from it? What do we say? What do we do? Do we do like David here and behave wisely? Or do we get a root of bitterness and begin to start plotting against our employer or our boss, whatever it is? So David behaved himself wisely. Therefore, when Saul saw that he behaved himself very wisely, he was afraid of him. Saul had hoped that David would throw a fit, act like a child, throw a temper tantrum, and then Saul could legally do something to him, put him in prison, punish him. But Saul saw that David behaved fine, and he was upset about it. So here is number 3 now. Here is the third attempt to kill David. Saul said to David, behold, my elder daughter Merab, her will I give thee to wife. Only be you valiant for me, and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul said, let not my hand be upon him, but let the hand of the Philistines be upon him. So Saul said, well, I don't want to be guilty of killing him. The people would be very upset because he's popular. So we will send him out in battle against the Philistines, and they will kill him. So David said to Saul, who am I, and what is my life or my father's family in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king? So he went out to fight the Philistines. It came to pass at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given unto Adriel, the Holithite, to wife. So apparently David went out and fought a bunch of battles. He came back, and the 3 months or 6 months, whatever, was up, and he was supposed to then been married to the king's oldest daughter. And instead of giving her away to David, the king again insulted David, hoping to make him mad, hoping to make him declare war against the king, or draw his sword and try to attack the king, whatever it was. He was hoping to prod him to do something that would be a crime that he could then have him arrested or punished for. But David didn't. What happened, though, is, and that was the third attempt. This was attempt number 3 for Saul to take David's life. He was hoping the Philistines would, and then obviously he was hoping David would get mad and do something wrong, because Merab, funny name for a girl, but that's what her name was. Merab, Saul's daughter, was given to somebody else. So verse 20, Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. So more time in the army, more time around the family of Saul. And Michal, the next daughter, apparently fell in love with David. And Saul said, I will give her to him that may be a snare to him. So again, this is the 4th attempt to kill David. Verse 22, Saul commanded his servants, saying, commune with David secretly, and behold, the king, tell him the king has delight in you, and all his servants love you. Now therefore be the king's son-in-law. And so once again, this next daughter then is offered in sort of a clandestine third-party way. Do what now? Move the Bible over? Yeah. I'm not sure I can read it. My wife thinks I should move the Bible over. Okay. I'll see if I can look up and also look sideways at the same time. Anyway, so Saul's servant spoke those words, and the servants of Saul said, on this matter, David said, you shall say to the king, the king desires no dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines to be avenged among the king's enemies. And so Saul hoped David would die by having to go out and try to kill 100 Philistines. But Saul knew, verse 28, that the Lord was with David, and Michal's daughter, Saul's daughter, loved him. And of course, we know the end of the story, that he came back successful in battle with twice the dowry that the king had wanted. Okay, number five. Number five is the fifth attempt of Saul to kill David. It also ends up being the first reconciliation of three. There are three reconciliations during this series of 21 attempts of Saul to kill David. Chapter 19 and verse 1. Saul spoke to Jonathan, his son, and to all his servants that they should kill David. So now the Philistines thing didn't work. So now he's saying to Jonathan and the other men of the army in Israel, I want you to kill David. Go seek him out and kill him. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David, and Jonathan told David, saying, my father seeks to kill you. Therefore, I pray you take heed unto the morning and abide in a secret place and hide yourself. And of course, we understand this account was one that we've read a number of times. And of course, this attempt to get the army and Jonathan to kill David didn't work because the army loved David, and so did Jonathan especially. Now, number six. Number six here we have, number 6, verse 8. And there was a war again, and David went out and fought with the Philistines and slew them with great slaughter, and they fled from him. And the evil spirit from the Lord was upon Saul as he sat in his house with his javelin in his hand, and David played with his hands. David was playing the harp. This is one of 3 times where David played the harp for Saul to calm down the influence of the evil spirit. Verse 10, Saul sought to smite David even on the wall with a javelin, but he slipped out of Saul's presence, and he smote the javelin into the wall. So this is the 6th attempt by King Saul to try to kill David. Okay, the 7th, verse 11. Saul sent messengers unto David's house to watch him and to slay him in the morning. So Saul was mad. He told some of his household servants, household army there, probably his own personal bodyguard types, go out to the house where David and Michal live and kill them when he comes in. He says, if you save not your life tonight, tomorrow, then you shall be slain. So basically, Michal told David that he was going to be killed by these men. She had seen them. So she let David down through a window, probably through a rope, and he went and fled and escaped. And she took an image and laid it in her bed and put a pillow of goat's hair there. So she was a loyal wife to David. And of course, her father punished her for that, as we read later. Okay, number 8, verse number 15. Saul sent the messengers again to see David, saying, bring him up to me in bed that I may slay him. So since it didn't work to catch him when he came in the house, Saul now told his messengers, go up to where he is in bed there and slay him in bed. This is attempt number 8. Okay, verse 17. Verse 16. When the messengers were come to the bed, behold, there was an image in the bed with a pillow of goat's hair for his bolster. So, of course, they found that there was a fake person in the bed. It wasn't really a person. It was just a couple pillows made up to look like a person. Okay, number 9, 10, and 11. Verse 17. Saul said unto Michal, why have you deceived me so, and sent me away my enemy, that he has escaped? And Michal answered Saul, he said unto me, let me go. Why should I kill you? So she basically said, well, David was going to kill me. She was trying to make it better for her, maybe also for him. So David fled, escaped, and came to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. And he and Samuel went and dwelt in Naioth. So David went to Samuel, the prophet, who was still alive. He's elderly but alive, in his place in Ramah. and told Samuel all that had happened. Saul sent messengers to take David, verse 20. So Saul again sent an army. He sent soldiers to take David. And when they saw the company of the prophets prophesying and Samuel standing as appointed over them, the Spirit of God was upon the messengers of Saul, and they also prophesied. So in this case, God supernaturally rescued David through his Spirit inspiring this company of soldiers to become overcome with spiritual inspiration of some kind, but they began then to prophesy or say inspired sayings. Maybe they were singing songs praising God. Who knows exactly what they were singing, but they were prophesying, it says, and they then were distracted and did not arrest or kill David. And when it was told Saul, he sent other soldiers, calls the messengers here, and they prophesied likewise. So again, God rescued David and saved him. And Saul sent messengers again the third time, and they prophesied also. So 3 separate times, Saul sent soldiers to kill or arrest David. And in all 3 times, the Spirit of God with Samuel there caused them to join Samuel in praising, singing songs, and saying prophetic inspired things. Okay, that was Numbers 9, 10, 11. Now number 12, verse 22. Then he also went to Ramah and came to a great well that is in Secu. And he asked and said, where are Samuel and David? And one said, behold, they be at Naioth in Ramah. And he went there to Naioth in Ramah, and the Spirit of God was upon him also. So Saul said, if you guys can't kill him, I'll do it. And he went up there, and the Spirit of God also stopped Saul from killing David. He prophesied until he came to Naioth and Ramah. He stripped off his clothes also and prophesied before Samuel in like manner, and lay down naked all day and all that night. Therefore they say is Saul also among the prophets. My guess is he was probably laying down, face down, and was kind of in some sort of a repentant or penance type attitude and talk. We don't know exactly what the significance of this is, but that seems to be what it actually would entail. One of the commentaries says he stripped off his armor and kingly robes. He didn't strip off all of his clothes. His underclothes were still on, but all of his trappings of being king, his armor and his kingly robes, and he was under the influence of the Spirit for a whole day and night. The commentary here says the person was considered naked when he laid aside his outer garments, leaving nothing on but his tunic and girdle. David was thus naked, 2 Samuel 6, when he danced. Isaiah walked naked by removing his mantle, or removed his prophet's mantle. So he didn't walk around as we would consider it to understand it. So he didn't have any of his outward clothes that would show his position or his honor from God. He just simply would walk around as an average person then. So I think that makes a lot of sense. At any rate, let's go to chapter, that was number 12. David, or Saul himself, also could not kill David because the Spirit of God interfered with him. Let's drop down to chapter 20 now. There's some intervening information here, but let's go to chapter 20 and verse 24. These are attempts number 13, 14, and 15 for King Saul to try to kill David. So David himself, this is verse 24 in chapter 20. David hid himself in the field. When the new moon was come, the king sat down to eat meat. And it's very likely either the day of trumpets, or it may have simply been the calendar of any new moon. And the king sat upon his seat, as at other times, even upon a seat by the wall. And Jonathan arose, and Abner by Saul's side, but David's place was empty. So they had assigned seats at these special meals, apparently. Verse 27, it came to pass on the morrow, which is the 2nd day of the month, that David's place was empty. And Saul said to Jonathan his son, wherefore come not the son of Jesse to meet, neither yesterday or today? And of course, Jonathan said, well, he's gone to Bethlehem, to the home of his ancestors' family, to make an offering to God. Now, verse 30 tells us something about Saul's anger and why he was angry. Verse 30, Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan, and he said, you son of a perverse and rebellious woman, do not I know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own confusion, and in the confusion of your mother's nakedness? In other words, you are choosing him over our own family. God had already told Saul through Samuel that his dynasty would die, that there would be no more kings of King Saul. But he did not want to accept that. Verse 31, as long as the son of Jesse lives upon the ground, you shall not be established, nor your kingdom. Therefore send now and fetch him unto me, for he shall surely die. So another attempt here by Saul to have David killed. And Jonathan answered his father and said to him, why should he die? What has he done? So Saul cast a javelin at him to smite him, whereas Jonathan knew then that he was determined by his father to slay David. So the anger of Saul was very obvious. He's getting upset because he's king, but now he won't be able to have his son sit on the throne. It'll go to somebody else. It was very important for them to have a dynasty. And I might also say that as an observation, could be that Satan, the devil, was inspiring King Saul through these demons to try to stop the line of David, the one that God Almighty chose to be the ancestor of Christ and the throne upon which Jesus Christ will return. The throne that is established forever is King David's. If had Saul killed him, that would not have been possible. So God was protecting him during this time. And of course, here now we have the parting of David and Jonathan, as they sort of knew that there was going to be rough sailing ahead. The next chapter concerns the priests. Let's go to chapter 22. Here, David is gathering a small army. He's living out in basically the hills, not too far probably from Masada, but out in that direction. Verse 3, David went thence to Mizpah to Moab, so Moab all the way over in the area where to the east and southeast of Israel, the area probably where Petra is today is Edom and Moab. And he took his parents there because he wanted to make sure his mother and father would not be used as a tool, either as extortion or, I'll kill your parents or else you let me kill you, something like that. So he thought to protect his parents, which was very, very wise. Verse 6, when Saul heard that David was discovered and the men were with him. So David was, the prophet Gad said that David abide not in the hold. And of course, somehow Saul here was told where David was. So Saul heard that David was discovered and the men were with him. Now Saul was in Gibeah under a tree in Ramah, having his spear in his hand, and all his servants were standing about with him. So he's ready to go kill as soon as he can. Saul said to his servants that stood about him, "Hear now, you Benjaminites, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards, and make all of you captains of thousands and captains of hundreds, that all of you have conspired against me." So he's accusing the tribe of Benjamin now, his own people, of accusing against him and conspiring against him. And there is none that shows me that my son has made a league with the son of Jesse, and there is none of you that is sorry for me, or shows unto me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as at this day. So this little speech tells us about Saul's feeling sorry for himself. And this comes through a number of times in his story, that he is a little bit, he's just feeling sorry for himself. Like, why don't you guys support me better? Why don't you go find David and kill him? Is he going to promise you all a vineyard, lots of money and reward if you don't? And here, none of you has promised. You're Benjaminites, and yet you haven't helped me establish my son and my kingdom. So basically, it's kind of a wine fest that he's going through here. And of course, it isn't all that great. So here we have the next section of betrayal of David by Doeg the Edomite, very evil man in this section of the Bible. And of course, one that eventually Doeg kills. The Edomite kills all the priests, quite a number of priests, about 60, I think, and a very, very evil thing in the sight of God. And Saul should have known better to even to allow that. Okay, number 16, let's go down to chapter 23 and verse 6. It came to pass when Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, fled to David in Keilah, that he came down with an ephod in his hand. In other words, he had the Urim and the Thummim, or at least a cover, a priestly cover like that. And it was told Saul that David was come to Keilah, and Saul said, God has delivered him into my hand, for he is shut in, by entering into a town that has gates and bars. So it was a walled city, small walled town, small city. And David then was in there, and Saul said, I'll surround it, and that will be proof that God has given him into my hand. Saul called all the people together to war to go down to Keilah and to besiege David and his men. Now, of course, God had it revealed to David what was going on, so David escaped. And God actually told David in a vision that the people of Keilah would actually betray him and deliver him up. So he escaped. They arose and departed. So that was attempt number 16. Attempt number 17. David, this is verse 13. David and his men, which were about 600, rose and departed out of Keilah and went whithersoever they could. And it was told Saul that David was escaped, and therefore he forbore to go forth. So David abode in the wilderness in the strongholds and remained in the mountain in the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul sought him every day, but God delivered him not into his hand. So Saul sought him every day. I don't know how many times, but in this little running around after they left Keilah, Saul was trying to kill him. And David saw that Saul was come out to seek his life, and David was in the wilderness of Ziph in a wood. So here we have this another failed attempt of Saul to kill David. Now let's drop down to verse 19. This is kind of after David and Jonathan renewed their covenant. They had a covenant of bond between them, and this may be the last time they saw each other alive. Verse 19, then came up the Ziphites to Saul at Gibeah, saying, does not David hide himself with us in the strongholds in the wood? So the Ziphites were willing to betray David, hoping to get some sort of reward, gold, silver, land, who knows. Therefore, O king, come down according to all the desire of your soul will come down, and our part shall be to deliver him into the king's hand. And of course, Saul says, well, blessed be you of the Lord, for you have compassion on me. And of course, he went down with the Ziphites, and it didn't work. Number 22, or verse 22, go, I pray you, prepare yet, and I know and see his place where his haunt is, and who has seen him there, for it's told me that he deals subtly. So therefore they take knowledge of the lurking places where he hides himself, and come you again to me with the certainty, and I will go with you, and it shall come to pass, if he be out of the land, I will search him throughout all the thousands of Judah. So they rose and went to Ziph. But David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon in the plain of the south of Jeshimon. So once again, David escaped from the plan of Saul. And Saul and his men went to seek him, and they told David wherever he came down into a rock and abode in the wilderness of Maon. And when Saul heard that, he pursued David in the wilderness of Maon. So this is attempt number 19, where Saul is again coming out in this wilderness, trying to find King David and kill him. Verse 27, there came a messenger to Saul saying, haste you and come, for the Philistines have invaded the land. So God inspired the Philistines to come invade, and then Saul had to quit chasing David temporarily while he went back and defended the territory of Israel. Now here we have the next section where David spares Saul's life. This would be during the 20th attempt of Saul to kill David. It begins in verse 1 of chapter 24. It came to pass when Saul was returned from following the Philistines that it was told him, behold, David is in wilderness of En-Gedi. And that's not too far from Masada. And the area of Qumran where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, it's just kind of up the hills and down a ways from there. So Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel and went to seek David and his men upon the rocks of the wild goats. So it's very steep. It's difficult to climb up there. They still today don't know how in the world those whatever men they were got the Dead Sea Scrolls up those cliffs and into those caves. They would have had to use some sort of rappelling with ropes, climbing with ropes. You simply can't climb up rocks that are that smooth and that sheer without some help. Verse 3, he came to the sheepcotes by the way, and there was a cave, and Saul went in to cover his feet, or we would understand it, to use the bathroom. And David and his men remained in the cave. And David said to him, behold, the day which the Lord has given you. The men all said, this is God's answer. He's given him to you. You can go in and kill him, and it'll all be over with. But David arose and cut off part of his skirt. And it came to pass that David's heart smote him because he had cut off Saul's skirt. And he said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing unto my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch forth my hand against him. So as you know, that Saul came out of the cave, and then David came out after him. And he made kind of a plea with him. Verse 9, David said to Saul, therefore you heard men's words, saying, behold, does David seek your hurt? Behold, this day your eyes have seen that the Lord has delivered you today into my hand in the cave. And some told me to kill you, but my eye spared you, and I said, I will not put forth my hand against the Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. Moreover, my father see, yes, all the skirt of the hand, and he held up the piece of his robe that was in his hand. And he says, I have not sinned against you, yet you hunt my life or my soul to take it. The Lord judge between me and you, and the Lord avenge me of you, but my hand shall not be upon you. And so after this, verse 15, the Lord therefore be the judge, and judge between me and you, and see and plead my cause, and deliver me out of your hand, or God deliver me out of your hand. It came to pass when David had made an end of speaking these words unto Saul, this is verse 16, that Saul said, is this your voice, my son David? And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. So his anger was obviously subdued. And here he understood that David was not trying to hurt him, that he was the one that was trying to do evil. He said to David, you are more righteous than I, for you have rewarded me good, whereas I have rewarded you evil. For you have showed me this day how much you dealt well with me, for as much as when the Lord had delivered me into your hand, you killed me not. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him get well away? Therefore the Lord rewarded you good for that you have done. The Lord reward you good for what you have done to me this day. And therefore, behold, I know well that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. So verse 20 shows us that Saul knew God's will, what God's will was, that David would be king, and his throne would be established. Verse 21, swear now therefore unto me by the Lord that you will not cut off my seed after me, and that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house. Now, this was fulfilled when the fourth son, the only one to survive the battle up at, I think it was at Gibeah, anyway, where the final battle was, where Jonathan and Saul died, and their three sons, Jonathan, his two brothers, and his father. But there was a fourth son who was lame in his feet and therefore unable to serve in the army. The name was Mephibosheth. And so he survived. And after King David became king, he mercifully allowed Mephibosheth to live out a natural life in the temple, or I'm sorry, in the palace, even though Mephibosheth was not a pleasant person, apparently. It was not, didn't deserve it, was very disrespectful. But at any rate, David did keep his word. Word given here is kept later in the Bible. Verse 22, David swore unto Saul, and Saul went home, but David and his men got back up to the hold. So here we have, then David goes out, and we have the account of Nabal and how he dies, and David then marrying Abigail. By the way, they were out protecting the people of Israel. So let's go down now to chapter 26. This is the 21st and final attempt of Saul to kill David. Again, we have these Ziphites. These are apparently not nice guys. These are guys who are hoping to curry favor with the king if they're able to help him kill David. Verse 1 of chapter 26, and the Ziphites came to Saul to Gibeah, saying, does not David hide himself in the hill of Hachilah, which is before Jeshimon? So here we have the Ziphites, who are the third time they were betrayed. The Ziphites were essentially countrymen of David. He knew them. He had protected them in the battles from the Philistines, and yet they were willing to basically betray him and stab him in the back. Verse 2, then Saul arose and went down to the wilderness of Ziph, having 3,000 chosen men of Israel with him to seek David in the wilderness of Ziph. This is the 21st time. I'll have to answer that later. So, verse 3, Saul pitched in the hill of Hachilah, which is before Jeshimon by the way, but David abode in the wilderness, and he saw that Saul came after him into the wilderness. So here we have the last time, and David makes another speech. David sent out spies. They knew where Saul was coming. David arose to the place where Saul had pitched his tent, and David beheld the place where Saul lay. And Abner, the son of Ner, the captain of his host, and Saul lay in the trench, and the people pitched round about them. So they knew where Saul was. He was asleep in his tent, and David's men said, "We'll go in and kill him." And David answered and said, "Ahimelech the Hittite and Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, brother of Joab, who will go down with me to Saul to the camp?" And so David went down there with him. Abishai came by night, and they took the spear and in the ground, and everybody was asleep. Saul didn't wake up. They went there very quickly, and they took his spear. David said to Abishai, "God has delivered," or Abishai said to David, "He has delivered your enemy into your hand this day. Now therefore let me smite him." So Abishai, who was one of the generals of David, or his leaders of his army, said, "Well, if you're not going to do it, I'll do it. I'll kill him." And of course, David said no. David said to Abishai, "Destroy him not, for who can stretch forth his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless?" And David said, "Furthermore, as the Lord lives, the Lord shall smite him, or his day shall come to die, or he shall descend into battle and perish." So David said, "Look, God has already said he's going to remove him. He will either do it in a battle or in a other natural way, or in a natural way." So verse 11, "The Lord forbid that I should stretch forth my hand, but take now the spear that is in his bolster and the cruse of water, and let us go." So they took the spear and the cruse of water, and David went out then to kind of a hillside off in the distance a little bit. Verse 13, "David went over to the other side and stood on the top of the hill afar off, a great space being between them. And he cried to the people, to Abner the son of Ner, saying, 'Answer you out, Abner.' Then Abner answered and said, Who are you that cry to the king?" And David said to Abner, "Are you not a valiant man who was like you in Israel? Therefore, why have you not kept the Lord protected?" Basically said, "Why did you let us go in there and take this spear of his and his cruse of water?" Verse 17, "Saul knew David's voice and said, 'Is that the voice of my son David?' And David said, 'It is my voice, O Lord, my king.' And he said, 'Wherefore does my Lord pursue after his servant? For what have I done? What evil is in my hand?'" This is the second time David is sort of lecturing him in public, saying, "What evil have I done? Now therefore I pray you, let my Lord the king hear the words of his servant. If the Lord has served you up against me, let him accept an offering. But if they be the children of men, cursed be they before the Lord, for they have driven me out this day from abiding in the inheritance of the Lord, saying, Go and serve other gods." So David said, "I'm basically on the run. I have no inheritance. Now therefore, let not my blood fall to the earth before the face of the Lord, for the king of Israel has come out to seek a flea, when as one doth hunt a partridge in the mountains." So this is now called the third reconciliation of David and Saul. That's what is listed as in the commentary. Then Saul said, "I have sinned. Return, my son, for I will do you no more harm, because my soul was precious in your eyes this day. Behold, I have played the fool and erred exceedingly." Now, this kind of tells us something about Saul, too, that he was willing to admit he made a mistake and that he was willing to say he was sorry. He didn't get all huffy-puffy and start cursing David. He actually admitted he was in the wrong, said he had erred exceedingly. So he did have a softer, more human touch to him. He really did. And it came out here. And David answered and said, "Behold the king's spear. Let one of the young men come over and fetch it. The Lord render to every man his righteousness and his faithfulness, for the Lord deliver you into my hand today. But I would not stretch forth my hand against the Lord's anointed. And behold, as your life was much set by me this day, mine eye, so let my life be set in the eyes of the Lord. So as I protected you, let God protect me, and let him deliver me out of all tribulation." Then said Saul to David, "Blessed be you, my son David. You shall do great things, and you shall prevail." So David went on his way, and Saul returned to his place. So this is pretty much the last conversation that they had. And the rest of the story of Saul is even more tragic, because instead of seeking God when the Philistines were coming to fight again, Saul then, actually he sought God. God didn't answer him, but then he went to a lady that had a familiar spirit. Chapter 28 and verse 4, "The Philistines gathered themselves together and came and pitched in Shunem, and Saul gathered all Israel together and they pitched in Gilboa. It's not too far from Bet Shean, if you've ever been to that central part of Galilee. And Saul saw the Lord of the host of the Philistines, he was afraid. It was a very large army the Philistines had brought, apparently. And his heart greatly trembled. And when Saul inquired of the Lord answered him not, neither by dreams, nor by Yemen, nor Urim, nor by prophets. So the stones wouldn't light up. He didn't have any answer from the Urim and Thummim. God did not answer him in a dream or by prophets. Of course, Samuel by this time was dead, but the answer simply, was that God was no longer with him. So Saul said to his servants, he didn't say, I'm going to fast for a week, fast for 3 days and 3 nights until God answers me. He said, seek me a woman that has a familiar spirit, that I may go to her and inquire of her. And his servant said to him, behold, there is a woman that has a familiar spirit at Endor. And Saul disguised himself and put on other raiment and went, and 2 men with him. Now, in the past, years before, Saul had ordered anyone that was dealing in familiar spirits to be put to death. And so when he came to see her, she basically said, are you here to kill me? And of course he said, no. Verse 10, Saul swore to her by the Lord, saying, as the Lord lives, there shall be no punishment happen to you for this thing. And of course, then the woman conjured up a demon that appeared like Samuel, but he did give an answer that Samuel would have given. Verse 16, Samuel said, therefore, why do you ask this of me, seeing the Lord is departed from you and has become your enemy? And the Lord has done to him as he spoke by me, for the Lord has sent or rent the kingdom out of your hand and given it the hand of your neighbor, David. Notice verse 18, because you obeyed not the voice of the Lord, nor executed his fierce wrath upon Amalek. So a sin many, many years before was the reason God took the kingdom away from him and gave it to King David. Then in verse 19, moreover, the Lord will also deliver Israel with you into the hand of the Philistines tomorrow, and you and your sons shall be with me. In other words, they're going to die and be in the grave. So the apparition, the demon masquerading as Samuel that was brought up, was honest and truthful about that on the next day they would die in battle, and they would be with him. They would be essentially dead in their grave. And so Saul, verse 20, Saul fell straightway all along the earth. He was sore afraid because of the words of Samuel, and there was no strength in him, and he wasn't going to eat. But then some of these women who were with the witch at Endor got him to eat. And of course, they were then in a battle the next day, and they simply all died, both Saul and David. Saul and Jonathan. That's chapter 31, the battle in Gilboa. The Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines. So they lost the war. They lost the battle. They were running. And the Philistines followed hard upon Saul and upon his sons, and the Philistines slew, that means killed, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, Saul's sons. As I mentioned, the fourth son had a leg injury, foot injury, and was unable to fight in the army. But in this case, the king saw all 3 of his sons, these 3 sons killed. The battle was sore against Saul. The archers hit him, and he was sore wounded of the archers. And Saul said to his armor bearer, draw your sword and thrust me through, unless these uncircumcised come and essentially torture me. He didn't want to be tortured, and he knew that he was going to die. But his armor bearer would not, for he was sore afraid. Therefore, Saul took a sword and fell upon it. And so Saul essentially took his own life, seeing that he was already going to die anyway. And when his armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he fell likewise upon his sword and died with him. So verse 6, Saul died and his 3 sons and his armor bearer and all his men that same day together with him. And of course, then eventually the Philistines cut off Saul's head. They hung his body up, which means they just simply put it on a pail or threw it over a wall. And that body then was rescued. Some valiant men came and took it away and mourned for Saul for 7 days. So a tragic life, tragic end to the life. But we see in some of these verses an ability to understand Saul's personality, his own personal feelings, his insecurities, his desire to not have to pay the penalty for what he had done. Obviously, he was a man who was torn in many, many ways, and a lesson, I think, for all of us, a good lesson, because we have not only a chance for better forgiveness today, but we also need to understand that we do things as God says, and hopefully we'll have our place in God's kingdom. So that's all for study of King Saul. And next time we'll start with King David. That may take a couple different Bible studies. We don't have time to obviously go through the tremendous amount of material plus all the Psalms, but we want to hit on some of the highlights of his life and some of the great lessons we can learn. So with that, we'll say good night and see everyone again next week.